Welcome, everyone.
Hey, Max.
Welcome. I'm Max Holmes. I'm President and CEO of Woodwell Climate Research Center. It's absolutely wonderful to see so many smiling faces in the audience. And I also want to welcome the people that are following online. So it's great to have this wonderful crowd. In a few minutes, we'll get to the star of the show, Joe Kennedy. But before that, a few thank yous. I want to thank Chris and Lisa Canab, who sponsor this series. Hopefully they're listening online. Thank you so much, Chris and Lisa. And in part, thanks to their support, it's been an incredibly busy summer. So I know many of you were here for the Woodwell Climate Conversation last month, July 22nd, featuring Conrad Anker. Yeah, that was a fun one. For those of you who weren't here, sort of a legendary mountain climber, but also a legendary storyteller, and related his sort of experiences in the mountains to what he saw with climate change and so on. So that was certainly powerful. The next day, so July 23rd, we went to Nantucket, and it was our first of the Woodwell Climate Conversations on the road, and so we had a conversation in partnership with Nantucket Conservation Foundation, and that was a wonderful event. Tomorrow, to treat the neighboring islands equally, we'll have an event on Martha's Vineyard in collaboration with the Island Grown Initiative. So we'll be talking about regenerative agriculture, local farming on the vineyard. Yeah. So we're keeping busy. Let's see, September 30th, our next climate conversation here at Woodwell. It will be down in the auditorium, not under the tent, but it will be with three of our experts, scientists, policy folks, focusing on some of the work that we're doing with communities in the Mississippi River Delta. So this is super cool and impactful work, and it's a good segue for, well, we'll get to Joe, but Joe made the original introduction with people in the Delta Regional Authority that got this work rolling. So you'll hear a lot more about that on September 30th. And the October 28th, just one more announcement about the climate conversation will be with Woodwell's Peter Frumhoff and Shuchi Chalati, and this will be on solar geoengineering, solar radiation management. So if you want to stir up a little controversy, come to that one. It should be good fun. One of our goals of this series, we love this place. We're incredibly excited about the work we do here. We always want more people to know about it, and I was told earlier today that since June, we've had over 200 new people, first-time people, show up at these events, either in person or online. So that's wonderful. So just if this is your first time at Woodwell, please raise your hand. Awesome, fantastic, and we certainly hope to see you again. But we also love the people who have been here a whole bunch of times. So if you've been to a Woodwell event more than 10 times, raise your hand. All right, so the groupies, and it's wonderful to see all of you here. All right, Joe Kennedy. Joe Kennedy III. You know, when I think about the sort of questions I want to ask in these things, I typically think past, present, and future. I want people to get to know the featured guest or guests. So tell us a little bit about your history, where you grew up, something about your family, that kind of thing. Now, yeah, exactly. So we're going to spend less time on the past and more time on the present and future, and with the understanding that most people have probably heard of Joe's family and know a bit about it. Joe, so you were represented Massachusetts in Congress from 2013 through 2021. We can talk a little bit about that, but I understand that you left Congress primarily so that you could be on the Woodwell board. You joined the Woodwell board in 2021, and we're certainly glad.
It was the best thing that came out of that, but yes.
Yeah. But that's not the only thing you've done since then. So I don't know where you want to start. You've been keeping busy. You maybe talk a little bit about your work with energy and climate, citizens' energy, and so on. How have you been spending your time?
So Max, thank you. And to the entire Woodwell team, thank you so much for having me back. I think some of you probably know I've had the honor of serving on the board, as Max said, for the past 5 or 6 years or so. And it has truly been an absolute pleasure. I got to know this place a little bit when I was serving in office. From some of you will know the name of John Holdren. When he was working in the Obama administration, I would see him from time to time doing the schlep on the shuttle back and forth, and we would commiserate about those flights. And at least when I got off a plane, I didn't have an hour and a half long drive, but he got to live here. So, and then obviously Phil Duffy and the work that Phil had done here in the leadership of this institute, and before he went off to serve in the White House as well. And so I start this conversation just saying, I think many of you know this, but Woodwell Climate Research Center is truly one of the great climate research institutes in the entire world. And it is we are trying to change this problem because it is a not well-known gem, but it is a more well-known gem than it used to be. But the work that comes out of this place is not just focused on preserving this extraordinary little slice of heaven that we have here in Woods Hole and these islands, but its impact resonates all over the world, and it is needed all over the world. So Max, and your entire team that you so capably lead here, just first off, and a huge thank you and a round of applause for all of you for what you do for us, for our kids. What have I been up to? You know, on the one hand, a lot of things. If you ask my wife, probably not enough, but nevertheless, you know, 2 little kids that seem to take up an awful lot of time, and between the summers that now they sleep in till they're 8 and 10. They try to sleep in till as late as they can. They never go to bed, and at this point, they're essentially feral. I can't wait for school to start. You know, that's kind of what we're up to at the moment. But look, one of the great opportunities you have in serving in government, I hope, and I think many of my former colleagues ascribe to similarly, is you have the chance to learn about a lot of things and throw yourself into some very complex challenges to try to figure out, one, what are the nature of the challenges we confront, and 2, how can you use the power of a government to address them? There is not a more consequential, more complex, more multifaceted issue than climate that our planet, right, not just our community, our country, but our planet is confronting. And so transitioning out of office, it was certainly something that I had the honor of working on a number of these issues when I was in office, and I wanted to find ways to stay connected to that work out of office. I wasn't entirely certain what that would look like. A dear friend who also served on this board reached out quickly thereafter, and Todd Hines, some of you will know Todd, and connected me formally with Woodwell, and so I was thrilled to be able to join the board. But in addition to that, I've kind of engaged in a number of other initiatives that have tried to wrestle with these kind of confluence of issues. I now lead an organization called Citizens Energy. Some of you will recognize that company. My father started it about nearly 50 years ago. It is a weird energy company. Don't tell him I said that, but it's a weird energy company. It is a nonprofit parent that sits on top of a bunch of for-profit entities. So we run the company as a proper for-profit business. The money goes up to a nonprofit parent, and we give the money away. We've given away over $600 million back to low-income families across the country and the communities that we serve over those 47 years. With the past 15 years or so, the company's transitioned into a diversified renewable energy company, so battery storage, microgrids, solar, and transmission. We are the largest provider of low-income community solar in Massachusetts and New York. We have the single largest low-income community solar facility in the country. It's in Southern California. We support about 120 homeless shelters and food pantries every winter in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. We pay a big part of their energy bills so they can keep people warm and keep people fed. And we are leaning very heavily into this moment we have now, where our communities, our country, our planet is desperate for more energy. Communities are skeptical about what that means for them, and we have to do this in a way that does not just mean pumping more fossil fuels and hydrocarbons into the atmosphere. So how do we wrestle with those 3 things? we think Citizens provides a pathway that and a model uniquely that can help kind of square that circle. And so I spent a lot of time, sadly, Max, on airplanes, which ain't great for solving that problem, but nevertheless, hoping that we will get to a place to more sustainably address that problem. Sorry for the long answer, but thank you.
No, that's wonderful. And let's talk a little bit more about sort of what is meant by the energy transition. And maybe start, like I find the Citizens Energy story fascinating and how it started, you said 50 years ago. And my understanding was the focus at that point was helping people around here afford heating oil. So it started off with on that issue, and now it's shifted to renewable, and then maybe use that as sort of an analogy of what we're trying to do more broadly.
So the mission of the company is to help low-income families meet basic needs. So which again is an odd mission statement for an energy company, but that's what the company is designed to do. My dad started it. He was doing, I wasn't even born yet when he started it, so it was a while ago. But he was doing stuff in Africa and Latin America, Central America. They were doing stuff all over the world in energy trading and oil and gas and a bunch of different things. We were most famous for this oil heat program. Some of you might still remember that phone number, 1-800-JOE-FOR-OIL. We have a new one for our solar program. It's called 1-800-1877-JOE-FOR-SUN, because the marketing budget was not expensive, right? So the goal behind this was the recognition that, and Max, we were talking about this a little bit before, but I think anybody that is involved in a climate space recognizes the tension that we have seen over the course of the past several decades, but something that our society is wrestling with now, which is physics. The physics behind climate change is very, very real. You can ignore it. It doesn't change the math. The math is real, and the math is getting worse in a lot of respects. Trying to help low-income families and communities make that transition and finding the sources of capital to be able to do so is a complex and big challenge to helping build the coalitions that are necessary to implement the public policy change through legislation. Because in order to pass the law, you need the votes. In order to get the votes, you need to have the support. And if you don't have the support, you don't get the people elected that can get you the votes, that can get you the policy. Citizens Energy has recognized that challenge between the economics that are necessary in the risk of, one, leaving communities behind, but two, where the brunt of that cost of climate is going to rest, which is on low-income families. And so we are trying to find and have a kind of a number of different programs to try to alleviate those costs that can, and then leverage significant other resources to bring to bear to try to help catalyze that, what that means for an individual and family that isn't necessarily thinking about this as, hey, how do I systematically address climate? But if we can help those families and help the math that those families are confronting such that they can then make that choice, and we can do that at scale, that can unlock the transition that so many of us are trying to catalyze.
You spoke a little bit about the role of government. Certainly when you were in Congress, that was one of the many areas I think you focused on, the energy transition and climate. We're in a different time right now.
You don't say.
Yeah. Maybe offer your thoughts on where there are opportunities right now, and then how we might be able to capitalize on different opportunities moving forward. Easy question for you, Joe.
We are enjoying a lovely evening together, and we are at a spectacular 501c3 designated organization. So I'm going to abide by the guidelines of a 501c3 here. Look,
which are essentially, I can say nothing in support of or against any candidate for political office. That's a bright red line that I won't cross, but...
I'm going to abide by most of that as well. Look, I think, Max, so I think there's the popular narrative behind this, candidly, and then I think there's the reality behind this. And I think the reality behind this does not wholly line up with the popular narrative behind it, if I'm being really honest. share a story with you. Max mentioned some of the work I've been doing separately through an organization that I started called Groundwork Project that helps support local community organizers in the Plains, Deep South Appalachia. So we're in Alabama, Mississippi, Oklahoma, West Virginia. Support about 40 different local community groups in these places, trying to help them grow and serve their communities however they can. It was now a couple years ago, I was in West Virginia, and this young organizer from a well-known national organization took me around to a bunch of sacrifice zones. Some of you will know what those are, outside of Charleston. And if you are familiar with the environmental history in West Virginia and Charleston, not far outside, you will see chemical plants that go on literally for miles. And there is one of the largest coal-fired power plants in the country. Brayton Point was an old coal and oil power plant in my district over in Fall River. This one is 5 times bigger than that one was. Every county in West Virginia is rural, so when I saw something that big, I went, one, that's huge. 2, where's the energy going? Because you don't need it here, and the answer was, it's not going here, it's going out of state, but they could permit it here, and we deal with the cost, but the other places get the benefit. And so this young guy took me around and did this amazing tour. And I shook his hand as we were wrapping up, and I was on my way to the airport. And he said, "Hey, can you answer me a question?" I said, "Yeah, I can try." 31 years old, organizer for a national, international environmental advocacy organization. And he looked me straight in the eyes and said, "How come you Democrats think we don't know how to work?" And the first thing I thought of was, if a Democratic Party cannot obtain the affiliation of a 31-year-old climate activist in West Virginia, where did we go wrong? And I said, give me a little more. And he said, the only thing you talk about when you talk about West Virginia is that we need to be retrained. We've got the hardest working workforce anywhere in the world. We built the industrial might of this country. I don't need you to tell me that coal mining is dangerous. Generations of my family did it. We sacrifice for our country, and we are proud of that sacrifice. So before you come in here and tell me we don't know how to work, how about you start with a thank you? I gave the guy a hug, and I said, "Where have you been for the past 5 years?" And so I say that because what so often gets parlayed through just national narratives here is that there is a pro-fossil fuel industry, and there is, but a pro-coal and then a pro-climate. That young man never said that the future was in coal, or that climate change wasn't real, or that we need to come up to revive coal to support his family or his future. He didn't believe any of that was going to answer the long-term viability of his community. He wanted to make sure that the commitment that he and his family have made for generations for his home wasn't denigrated, looked down upon, ignored, and taken advantage of. And what I used to tell folks all the time was that those coal miners are our fishermen. And most folks in Massachusetts would recognize that there's a tension between fish and fishermen and conservation, but the answer isn't abolish fishing. That's not normally the answer that most people come up with. We got to find a balance about how to do this sustainably and appropriately, and take care of those that have reaped this harvest. And so I say that to say, a lot of the work that I think that needs to be done is actually having some of those conversations that aren't saying, "Hey, let's celebrate putting folks out of work because you don't know what you're profiting off of climate change." They're trying to find a way to care for their families. And if you don't give them another opportunity or another option, that's going to be what you do, because that's what people do. They care for their family. If you are able to, and if an environmental community can find ways to actually engage, and a lot of people are doing this, I don't mean to say it's not being done, but engage in that work to build that coalition that isn't based on finger pointing and dividing wedges and driving wedges, but is built upon addition, not subtraction, that is where I think we need to go.
So the math associated with the energy transition, I think, has shifted a lot over really recent years. And for a decade or two, the energy demand, the electricity demand in the U.S. was flat. So if we think, and at the same time, renewable energy was getting cheaper, more available, and so on. So it was let's say, easier to see how we can do this transition. Now, for reasons we can talk about, energy demand is skyrocketing. So I think the country and the world, you would agree, I think, needs more energy and we need less emissions. I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago in Telluride, Colorado. It was an interesting one. They brought together about 15 climate scientists and 15 energy people, oil and gas folks. And the agreement there, sort of the price of admission, was you had to agree on those two things. We need more energy and less emissions. And then the task was, to think together, how do we get there? And it's a big challenge, Joe, but I'm curious, that, first of all, do you agree with that framing? We need more energy and less emissions, and sort of, if you can elaborate on your thoughts about how we might get there and how rapidly we might achieve both of those things.
Yeah, so yes, I wasn't invited to the conference, but maybe next year. But yet, yes. So yes, we need more energy, and we need less emissions. And I don't think, Max, I think certainly everybody in this audience would agree that those two things are not mutually exclusive. You can in fact do both. How we get there is perhaps a bit more complicated question, but complicated because there's a lot of ways to get there. I would start by saying under the most aggressive policies and plans going forward, there is still going to be a role for an oil and gas industry in this country certainly in the next 10 years, and probably a lot longer than that, right? Like, you are not going to abolish that out of our economy in the immediate term. The question is then, how do we, knowing that there are communities that are going to rely on those sources, how do we incentivize, one, the deployment of existing technologies that we have today to dramatically scale up through wind, solar, and now even more so, these costs are coming down dramatically, battery storage, still cheaper, still not at industrial scale necessarily cheap, but as those costs come down, it unlocks every incremental aspect of renewable energy. So how do we lean into that? How do we actually think of smart transmission planning? Because in many places where we actually generate those electrons, that electricity is not proximate to the place where the electricity is used. So how can we leverage those technologies and leverage energy storage technologies in such ways that can help catalyze this? And third, I think, Max, is some of the work that we're trying to do at Citizens is to come up with innovative financing models to say, you can do that, and that doesn't have to be extractive of the places where the stuff is built, or the places where the energy is harvested, or the places where how it is moved, right? So you can do this in ways that local communities that host this infrastructure actually are treated as the stakeholders they are, and get the long-term benefits that they deserve, and by the way, have deserved, rather than thinking, hey, we should just railroad this stuff through. And the reason why we say that term railroad is because that's what railroads did. And that's what, if you were running a utility company today, and this is not true for every utility company, but it's true for a lot of them, major developers, et cetera. If you're running a multi-billion-dollar corporation, chances are you're in your 50s or 60s. Chances are then you came of age through this where community engagement, community benefit programs weren't things that were the first things you learned about or were taught or gave a whole lot of thought to because you didn't need to. But a younger generation of these leaders that are finding that, hey, local communities, whether you are in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, or Kansas, don't like the use of eminent domain and don't like massive towers being built in their backyard if they don't have a say in it, and if they don't have a stake in it, and just being told, too bad. So is there a way that we can actually use these financing models to make sure that those communities get a real benefit over it, and what does that look like? And if you actually do that, that changes the nature of that conversation. It doesn't mean that you get to yes immediately, but it does create space to align a whole lot of other incentives that otherwise are in conflict. So I think if you can do those three things, you help to transition this into a way that we can get there a lot more quickly than otherwise.
In a minute, we'll open it up for questions from the audience, and I'll emphasize that the question should end in a question mark, and it should be relatively brief. And generally, people are really good at that. But But before we go there, another easy question for you, Joe. So one of the drivers of the increase in energy demand right now in the U.S. and across the world is both AI and data centers associated with that. And I'm wondering how you think about those two things, pros and cons of AI, benefits and costs and so on, as well as just the controversy associated with siting and building of data centers now.
I mean, Max, good Lord, right? Like, so
I didn't say it was going to be easy.
I would like, I mean, good Lord, again, right? So I would say this on AI. I think, I don't mean to be Pollyannish about it. Is this technology potentially going to unlock enormous benefit for society? Yes. Like, I think full stop, period, that's true. Does it mean it could hasten the ending of the world? Like, actually, yeah, it might. So, like, I don't know. I've seen those same charts that you all have had, which, like, if the ending of the world is, like, the probability is creeping up, we might want to do something to, like, tap that back down, because that would be bad. I chafe against the idea that this feels like a race led by literally 4 guys that seem to not like each other very much and that are then going to unleash a technology that no one really knows the full-on consequences of on the rest of us and told, like, we'll deal with it later. Like, that seems like a really bad way to go about this. So I don't love that. I also would say I don't think that the idea of saying no is an answer either. And that's not to say, hey, AI data centers everywhere are inevitable and we just have to deal with it. No, that's not the case. But it is to say, like everything else, I think there's a narrative between these two sides from an administration that's saying, we're in a race against China. They don't share our values. This is existential. We have to win. Okay. What does winning look like and when will we have won? No one has explained that to me. I don't think that's the right way to frame that question. I think it's a good way to scare people and to try to get them into ceding their interests or whatever else in a race, in a quest here that is not, again, the right way to frame the question. I do think that there's I think there are policies out there that can help minimize the downside, give some rules of the road, unleash kind of American entrepreneurial innovation that can be beneficial to us. But we are joking ourselves if we are saying we have wholly wrapped our heads around the risk. And by the way, the developers of this stuff haven't either, right? Like, every week there's a new headline about, sorry, my bot, like, jumped outside of its case and hacked some other thing and threatened to take down the financial system. Sorry, like, I don't know, like, sorry seems not to quite cut it on that one, right? So, like, there does need to be guidance here. So, yes, there's an upside. I think there's ways to incentivize that upside. There's ways to minimize that downside. This administration doesn't seem to be wholly engaged in that part, which I think is a big challenge. And you're starting to see the developers behind this actually ask for that guidance because they want it, right? They want some part of it. We can get into that. I do think, Max, the data center piece obviously is aligned with this. I think what you're seeing in the movement around data centers is a public is increasingly uneasy about what this means for either you, your kids, your grandkids, so they can have a job. What does that look like? And the data center thing is the piece that you can hold on to and say, okay, we can't stop all of this, but we can stop that. Been talking to folks in state legislative candidates in Alabama, in the Black Belt of Alabama last week, that were knocking on doors. I said, what's the number one issue that you guys are hearing from your communities? It's data centers in the Black Belt of Alabama. I was talking to folks in West Virginia from the Eastern Panhandle and the Northern Panhandle and Central West Virginia. They were knocking on doors. I said, what's the number one issue that you guys are confronting on your doors? Data centers. West Virginia, 97% white, rural. Black Belt of Alabama, very black. Rural. But both of those places, West Virginia, deep history of extraction, the energy issues, the mining, et cetera. But the fact that those are issues, top-of-line issues on doors for people thousands of miles away, very different communities, some comparisons, but very different, and that's the number one issue that is breaking through. I would not have expected the minority leader of the House of Representatives of Alabama having the same talking points about something on a local issue the same way that a candidate in rural West Virginia was talking about it, and they are. So does this infrastructure have a place in society today? If done right and with respect to local communities in that conversation, yes. Does that mean signing everybody up on an NDA and not telling them about it until it's already done, and then once it's done, giving away some like baseball jerseys? Like, no, that's not the way this should be done. And I think we're about to see this fight play out across our political system in the months and years ahead.
Questions from the audience?
Okay, there have been 400 bills introduced to Congress about AI, and only 30 of them have passed. This is a peripheral
Surprised
effect.
it's 30. That's right.
Right. This has a peripheral effect on industries like renewable energy that you've been involved in. Given your family's legacy on change over the last, few decades and stuff, where would you like to see young people that, were promised a job in software engineering and whatever as close as 6 years ago that is almost, set to become extinct? Where do you want us to focus our energy?
Oh my goodness.
Good question.
So I would say I'd like to think about it, but given the fact that I can't, I'd give you a couple. I'll give you a couple answers. I'll give you the answer of a guy on stage that doesn't have to deal with it, and I would give you kind of like the systemic answer, and then I'll try to give you what I think if I were in your shoes I would do. It seems to me, from like having paid attention to some of the feeling viscerally over the course of the past 10 years plus, that the country is starting to pull itself apart. And that given certain political leadership, that has been accentuated. Like those wedges are being deliberately pushed to force you to choose on what sports teams you root for, what music you listen to. Like there's a good side with us and against us on all of the stuff that just we shouldn't have to do. An isolation, a loneliness, a despair, right? Deaths of despair was not a thing until it was coined in a term in a book several years ago, codified, and then like people realized that Bowling Alone, written by Robert Putnam, codified by Putnam years ago, but that's become a much more accepted as true as the nation kind of pulls apart. I do think there is I hope, if there is a significant dislocation in the workforce, which I think is likely with AI, it is also true that we have tens of millions of people in this country who, like, the biggest thing that they need is somebody next to them, paying attention to them, making sure that they do not fall through the cracks, whether that is a 13 or 14-year-old kid whose single parent is working 2 jobs, whether that is a senior citizen that is isolated and benefits from Meals on Wheels, and that is the only other human contact that they get every week. And the millions of people in between. There are a whole lot of people that just want and need human contact. And there are tens of millions of people that have time to give. So if you think of that from, which is not the right way to think of it, as a market, you've got millions of people that have time to give and millions of people that need people with time to give. And we have never found a way to match it. The way that often comes off in policy framework is national service. This isn't like, I'm not talking about City Year or the Peace Corps. I'm talking about finding ways to actually connect community back together again. Some of the greatest organizations that we support, most innovative ones that we support through Groundwork, it's a mutual one is a Red Dirt Collective in Norman, Oklahoma. It's a small little organization run by some folks that don't have a whole lot of money. You know what they do? Whatever a neighbor needs. Your kid's got a flat bike tire, they'll fix your bike tire. You need diapers, they'll find your diapers. You need formula, they'll find your formula. They just source whatever you need, and they just build. And so how do we find ways to build? Can that dislocation create the opportunity to where somebody would, in a moment, would say, I have nothing to do? That's crap. Spending time next to somebody who doesn't have contact with anybody else, that is not time. That is relationship building. That is everything to that person that needs it. Truly everything. that is easy for me to say when I can diagnose that as a problem without saying, at the moment, there's no way to monetize that. There's no job I can give you for that. But what I can also say is what this country has a history of is young people diagnosing that challenge that they are confronting and just being relentless about the world that they want to build. And I can give you chapter and verse over and over and over again of those young people that have said, the way that you all have designed the society is no longer applies to our lived reality, and we're going to go change it, and you have. And is that comfortable for folks in power? No, it's not. Too bad. That's like what you sign up for. So what would I urge you to do? What I would urge you to do is, like, what we saw after ICE agents were surged into Minneapolis wasn't just a community there rejecting abhorrent use of force in the name of the federal government, in our name as well. It was a community that found ways to care for one another in the midst of a surge of enormous force from the federal government. But what did they do? They found ways to do that. So what would I say to do? Gosh, find those ways to build those coalitions together. There will be opportunity that comes from that, and you will change our world. We've seen that happen here in the past 6 months. Good luck, and hurry up. I'll repeat the question. You're good.
All right. If you compensate localities for externalities, and if you were talking about creative financing for doing that, but we're in a market economy, wouldn't you need legislative first that gives people like a property interest in clean air or these externalities? Did you understand the question?
Yes. Can I repeat the question? Probably. I'll do my best. There was a lot of big words in there, and it's been a while, right? But the question essentially was, if you're talking about compensating communities for externalities that are put in place in a system, in our economic system, don't you need legislation that confers a property right on folks like clean air or some ownership right for which they are compensated? I would say, look, that would...
Oh, and the other part was, I heard you say that creative financing was what you were going to do to achieve that goal. And so could you explain
how the creative financing achieves that goal? I can, yes. Yes, and. So would it legislation that conferred a property right on those things be like, that would be enormously helpful. I don't think we're likely to get that anytime soon, but yes, I would love for that to happen. What Citizens Energy, essentially our model, is we have iterated the model on transmission finance. So we partner with developers on financing of large transmission assets, whether that's upgrades for existing systems or building new lines. Let's say, for the sake of argument, $1 billion line to bring wind energy from northern Maine to Boston. Say it's $1 billion. We would say, okay, instead of Central Maine Power, you spending $1 billion yourself, you put that into the rate base for your customers, and you spend that. You raise the $1 billion. You spend part of that for debt, part of that through equity, and you get repaid over a 30-year period of time at a regulated rate of return because you're a monopoly, and that's kind of the way that system works. What that means is that company, any major utility, raises money from someplace far away, debt markets, capital markets, builds something locally, and then gets paid a return, 8-9 blended rate, 8-9% of their investment for the next 30 years. Local communities get literally under that, nothing, kind of just what that developer decides to give away. That's it. So it is still extractive, right? You're putting something locally, and the profits of that still get sucked back out to those shareholders of that company or the debt and equity holders, right? What we say is, great, let us finance a portion of it, however big we can get, 10, 15, 20%. So Central Maine Power, in this example, you finance, same $1 billion line, you're going to finance $800 million, we're going to finance $200 million. We then take our $200 million and give at least half of those profits away back to the communities that where the stuff is served. So it would be a heck of a lot better if we had some sort of enabling legislation that gave folks a property right that they could claim along the way. But what we've done is say, look, we're not going to wait for that to happen because I think it's going to be a while before that legislation passes. But we can, and again, we have to find a partner that is willing to help to let us in on a deal. So I've been told no. I get shot down all the time, right? I take lots of plane rides to get told no all over the country. But every now and again, you get told yes. So it's taken us 3.5 years working through the regulatory process in California, which is not quick, unfortunately, to help finance $1 billion of PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric, their transmission upgrades. So 5 tranches of $200 million. We'll give away half of our profits off the first, 60%, 70%, 80%, 90% of the profits off that last tranche. So it's a 35-year program. We will mobilize just shy of $500 million that will go back to those ratepayers in those communities, and we will spend that on about 55,000 families a year. We'll give them $300 a year off their energy bills. Now, there's no program of its kind that does that in the country. $500 million is a lot of money. $500 million across that service territory over 35 years is not nearly as much money as it should be. And so part of my argument to my former colleagues in office today is if the grid between the transmission grid and the distribution grid, and the distribution system is regulated differently, regulated by the states, transmission is regulated by the federal government, but there's trillions of dollars that have to be spent in this. So rather than saying just, hey, for us, one project, one utility, $1 billion, what if you said 20% of that multi-trillion-dollar spend went back to communities like that in some form of community equity ownership? That's hundreds of billions of dollars a year in profit that at this moment does not exist. And what could you then do with that? And does that solve all of these problems? No, it doesn't. But if you turn back around to Fall River and you say, hey, coming into you, Fall River, Massachusetts, is another $5 or $6, $7, $8 million a year. Remember, Fall River, Massachusetts, years ago, they had to start charging people additional money for garbage collection because they couldn't afford the waste management contract. Fall River doesn't have a whole lot of folks with a disposable income where that's an easy additional expense to pass on. If you can lay off that cost, if you can start addressing some of the impermeable surfaces that are creating discharge into Mount Hope Bay that is now poisoning that watershed and the Taunton River. If you can lay off that cost, all of a sudden that otherwise Fall River doesn't have the tax base to fund, but you can do that because there's an interconnect coming from an offshore wind farm into Brayton Point. And that community, rather than getting 5% of that, gets 20% of that so that they can fund this. That's a different, and it's a 30-year deal off of one program. That's a different conversation. So that's one idea.
From my perspective, I've seen society and humans be very good at doing things that cause a lot of damage very quickly and sort of trailblazing ahead, whereas things that bring healing and push things in a more progressive direction are not only fragile, but take a lot more time to build. Would you agree with this perception? And if so, what ways do you see that we can kind of close that gap in timing?
What's her name? Where are you from? Abigail?
Yeah, Abigail Bonington. I'm a grad student at Hui, but yeah.
So I would say a couple of things. One, I think building is, by definition, takes longer than tearing down, right? It takes a long time to build a forest. It takes a short time to cut it. So I appreciate the observation. I don't want to fight your hypothetical a bit, but I will fight a little bit of it and say, like, the building part, by definition, just takes time on anything. The United States is far from perfect in any of these things, right? But I will tell you, if I can, and if you'll indulge me, My office used to be a couple doors down from a guy named John Lewis. Does that name mean anything to you? Abigail, it sounds like from your accent you might not be local. John Lewis was thank you. John Lewis was a civil rights hero in the United States. Marched with Dr. King when he was a very young man, was beaten, almost killed off of in a very famous race riot in Alabama, the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. He served as a member of Congress and was kind of regarded as the conscience of Congress, and was a dear friend personally to me, but to my grandfather. And just like, if you could saint a man in American politics, he would be at the top of the list, right? And I think most of you would agree with me here. If he ain't getting sainted, the rest of us are screwed, right? He was the most optimistic man in the U.S. House of Representatives, which is not a wholly optimistic place, but he was by far the most optimistic. And I think he was optimistic because he had seen the human capacity for change, and he had lived it, and he helped bring it, and he lived that out, but over the course of his life. And if you think of where he was as a young man, I think in his late teens, early 20s, where he was beaten with a metal rod almost to death and left to die on that bridge and survived. He told a story. He was, some of you will remember this moment. My aunt was with him at this, and she told me the story of, there was a mass shooting, because they happen in this country more than anywhere else. There was a mass shooting at a church in Charleston, South Carolina, several years ago, Mother Emanuel AME. And a number of people died. They welcomed in a new member of the congregation, and he took out a gun and shot over 10 people. A year later, they had a commemoration, and a number of people went down to remember the victims, John Lewis among them. And my aunt was with Mr. Lewis, and they had a meeting with a number of the survivors of the shooting that day. And to a person, every one of them forgave that shooter, which is an extraordinary act of forgiveness. Mr. Lewis got up, and he then talked about the power of forgiveness. And he talked about what it was that those folks had just done. And then he shared that when he was a young man, he had been beaten by the Klan in South Carolina. And years later, he was a member of Congress from Georgia. And he got a knock on the door one day, and an older gentleman came in with his son, and they asked for the congressman, and Mr. Lewis came out. And the guy said, "Mr. Lewis, you're not going to remember me, but many years ago when you were in South Carolina, you were beaten by the Klan." I think it was South Carolina. You were beaten by the Klan. I was one of the people that beat you that day. And I'm here with my son because I wanted him to see me apologize. And they hugged and they cried. And so, yes, that took decades to build. And I don't know how many other people were destroyed or hurt or injured or traumatized along that trajectory, and it was a lot. But I do know the impact of that story, and I know the impact of that forgiveness and of that redemption and the commitment to that country, that community that Dr. King was trying to build, that blessed community that we are all trying to get to. And ultimately, it comes down to a question of, is it worth the fight? Because I can guarantee you over the course of your career and life before you, you will find plenty of examples of where destruction outpaces progress. But ultimately, the question is, one, what are the choice we got? And two, like, is that change possible? Like, yes, it is. I mean, look at what the science that Woodwell has put out, and like, yes, there's concern, there is threat about what we are doing to our planet. There's also enormous opportunity that they have helped pioneer and drive, that you all are doing at Hui as well. And like, one guy decides to ignore science because he doesn't like math. Like, okay, like, it can be enormously damaging all over the world, and it is. But he doesn't get to decide that future for my kids. Like, sorry, that's on camera, but like, we can do this. And if John Lewis can do that, we can do this.
I would normally take it as a bad sign if I look out in the audience and I see tears in lots of people's eyes, but in this case, powerful answer. Iris.
This is a little more technical, but
This is a little more technical, but
yeah. What has happened to the promise of electric batteries? I know about electric cars, but for years when we were talking about solar power and replacements for oil and coal, there was a whole lot of interest in electric batteries. And I actually have a young friend who worked for about 10 years and talked about how China's doing this and everything. Has that ever come across as,
your young friend's right. China's doing a lot of it.
yeah, well, why aren't we, or are we?
Well, I could give you one reason. It's 5 letters and starts with T. Right? That would be part of the reason. Max can give you can flesh out more of that answer. But it's not. Look, to be fair, it's not only that's not the only reason. So when you say electric batteries, battery storage, there's a number of different technologies around what that energy, how to store that energy at what scale, at what cost, and how we do it. So part of this is like there's a lot there to unpack if you're actually thinking of it that way. I mean, part of this, the model there on batteries was if you have an electric vehicle, every EV, as you roll that out, every EV itself is a battery. And so you can use that to create a relationship with the energy use in your home, right? So if you scale do that out at scale, you all of a sudden have this you have a battery storage component at scale that can be leveraged. Citizens Energy does a number of battery storage programs. We do something technical called frequency regulation, and we try to do peak shaving, which is a technical term around the way in which our energy system works. So very briefly, if you think of the system like a plumbing system, right, you can have a big pipe and you can have a smaller pipe. If you don't have water through the big pipe, you don't get stuff to the smaller pipe, right? If you're trying to use energy when there's a lot of demand on that system, there's peak charges there because it's more expensive to use at a time of higher demand. What these systems do is they charge these batteries up when it's cheap, and then we forecast when that demand is likely to be, and then we discharge when the demand is so that you actually use less electricity at peak demand so that you save money. Long story short on that, for actually some reasonable perspective, a lot of that technology to do that, the guts to it, the electronics, come from China. The big beautiful bill, so framed, put restrictions in place around importing a bunch of that stuff from China, and so that has been a hindrance to our battery storage, our part of that ecosystem. As much as I would rail against that, I would also say it's not the worst thing in the world from a national security standpoint or from a domestic manufacturing standpoint to actually incentivize some of that to be done here rather than having a bunch of the guts of a electric system be built by China if you have concerns about what they might do if they wanted to flip a switch and disrupt our entire electric system. So, I don't love it in the short term. It's not to say that there's actually an objective there that is more meaningful in the long term, but there's a disruption in the midst of it. Larger scale, the costs on these batteries writ large are coming down. There is progress being made, but it takes longer to make progress at scale, particularly if you don't have a federal government behind it, incentivizing it and sending signals to business of saying, this is something we want to do because the real power on that unlock comes from renewables. And it makes renewables far more viable because you can generate it stuff when the wind is blowing, and then you put it in the battery when the wind is blowing, and then you can discharge it when it's not. If he's out there killing every wind farm and paying utility companies to kill wind farms and put it into oil and gas instead, the utility of a battery is not as economical or not as useful as it would be otherwise. I don't know, Max, if you want to clarify any of that.
My short answer would be just as there is tremendous progress in the deployment of wind and solar and the prices are going down rapidly on those things across the world, and even including still in the U.S., the same is true for batteries. They are being rapidly developed and deployed and are playing an increasingly important role in storing the energy that is produced when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing, and then deploying it when those things aren't happening. And while China is leading the charge on a lot of this, Massachusetts also has a lot to be proud of. There are companies in Massachusetts that are really leading in the development of wind and other renewable technologies. We just have a few minutes left. I'll ask one more question. Maybe we'll also take one more from the audience. And I'm wondering if you're going to be able to answer this in the next half hour. But Joe, you mentioned you have an 8 and a 10-year-old, and I want you to picture the world, or the possible worlds when they're, let's say, 80 and 82, and I can imagine I can think of some really negative scenarios in places that we don't want to go. But I want you to lean to the most optimistic scenario you can think of, and describe what things look like in the U.S., maybe what things look like globally. Share any thoughts you may have about what we can do to get to that good place. And you have 90 seconds to.
Yeah, right. Look, Max, if there are a couple things that I am sure of, which, there's not as many as maybe there used to be, but if there's a couple things that I'm sure of, I've had the great privilege, I think probably like many of you, to travel to a lot of places around the world. I have never been to a place where if you find a group of kids, if you throw a ball at them, they don't pick it up and throw it back. Right? Kids are kids. And so the opportunity, if I turn around and say, okay, well, what could that world look like in 80 years with on the cusp of this revolution that we literally can't wrap the human brain around because nobody knows exactly what doors we are unlocking. What I hope we can unlock gets to a couple of questions we had over here, is I do believe that, like, at our core, human beings are social animals, that we have really kind of a few basic needs, and if you take care of those, like, we're more or less okay. People want a roof over their head, they want food on their plate for themselves and their loved ones, they want a safe and secure retirement, they want their kids in a good school, and if you can they want access to healthcare, they want clean air and clean water. And if you can kind of take care of that for them and create a community that they can engage with others, like, we're actually going to be in a pretty happy place. And I think if we think about what possibilities could be unlocked by this, like, that should be able to be true. That's not to say it will be true, but it should be able to be true if we make the right policy choices and create the right incentives. And I'm not smart enough to be able to tell you that work's going to exist or work's not going to exist, but I do think that we can turn back around and say, if the point of a job is to provide the economic resources to be able to do those things, if you can actually do those things by spending time and being with community and caring for each other, then, like, that would be work. Then that would be a job. And then can we find a way to create those structures? And gosh, I hope so. Look, I hope my kids are able to enjoy a winter. I hope they're able to see a coral reef. I hope they're able to, like, enjoy a sunrise from Nauset and a sunset from Martha's Vineyard. And I hope they're able to experience this spectacular place that this world is, and the spectacular people that populate it. Am I worried about that? Yeah. It takes the decisions of very few people to destroy what so many others have built. It is also true, human history makes this point over and over and over again. Those strategies of those several do not work in the long run. They just don't. And so even if they mess it up, if my kids are 80, you'll be 90, like, maybe you can course correct along the way.
I think that's a perfect place to wrap it up. Joe, thank you so much for spending the evening with us.
Thanks,
you all
everybody.
for being here.